The air smelled of sulfur and blood. In the shadowed corridors of a field hospital somewhere in the Pacific, a young Japanese officer lay on a canvas stretcher, his uniform torn and darkened with dirt and sweat. His eyes darted from ceiling to doorway, waiting for the blow that never came. He had been taught that capture meant dishonor worse than death. He had been told the Americans would torture him, mock him, parade him through the streets like a broken animal. But the hands that reached for him now were gentle. A U.S. Army nurse, her face obscured by exhaustion and the dim light of kerosene lamps, knelt beside him. She did not spit. She did not shout. Instead, she peeled back the blooded fabric of his sleeve with the careful precision of someone who had done this 100 times before. Her fingers, stained with iodine, worked quickly to clean the ragged wound left by shrapnel. And then she did something the officer could not comprehend. She smiled at him. Not with triumph. Not with pity. But with the kind of weary kindness one reserves for a younger brother who has stumbled home bruised from a fight. This was not supposed to happen. In the indoctrination sessions, in the speeches delivered by stern-faced commanders, in the propaganda reels that flickered across barracks walls, the Americans were demons. They were said to be without souls, without honor, without mercy. Yet here, in the ruins of war's final chapter, something impossible was unfolding. Enemies were being healed. Monsters were being rewritten as human beings. The officer's breath came in shallow gasps. Pain radiated through his body, but it was a different kind of pain now, one that fractured not just bone, but belief. Around him, other captured soldiers lay in similar states of shock and disbelief. Some wept quietly. Others stared in silence at the canvas ceiling, their minds struggling to reconcile what they had been taught with what they were experiencing. The Pacific War had been a furnace of hatred, a crucible where men were taught to kill or be killed. But in this sterile corner of the inferno, a strange alchemy was taking place. Compassion was dissolving the armor of propaganda, one bandage at a time. To understand the depth of their shock, you must first understand who these men were, and what they had been made to believe. From the moment they could hold a wooden rifle, Japanese boys destined for military service were drilled in the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior. Honor was not simply a virtue, it was the architecture of existence. To die for the emperor was transcendence. To surrender was to erase not only your own name, but to curse your family for generations. In the military academies of Tokyo and Hiroshima, young officers were taught that the individual was nothing, a single grain of rice in the sacred bowl of the nation. And that grain must be willing to burn. The propaganda was relentless. In classrooms and assembly halls, instructors displayed photographs of supposed American atrocities, images of mutilated prisoners, fabricated accounts of torture and humiliation. The message was clear: the enemy was subhuman, savage, incapable of compassion. To fall into their hands was to invite a fate worse than death. Better to die with a grenade clutched to your chest than to suffer the degradation of capture. And so they believed. Diaries recovered from the Pacific Islands reveal the depth of this conditioning. One young lieutenant, stationed on Saipan, wrote to his mother, "If I am wounded and cannot fight, I will take my own life. I will not allow the beasts to touch me." Another officer, preparing for the defense of Okinawa, recorded in his journal, "We have been told that the Americans eat the flesh of prisoners. I do not know if this is true, but I believe it must be. What else could explain their cruelty?" This was the lens through which they viewed the world as the war dragged into its final, desperate months. They had been raised in an empire that celebrated death over dishonor, that rewarded self-destruction with the promise of eternal glory. The concept of an enemy showing mercy was not just foreign, it was literally unimaginable. It existed outside the boundaries of their reality. And yet, as the war turned against Japan, as the islands fell one by one to American forces, thousands of these officers found themselves in precisely the position they had been trained to avoid, wounded, captured, and at the mercy of the enemy they had been taught to hate. What awaited them was not the expected nightmare. It was something far more disorienting. It was kindness. And kindness, for a man raised to die rather than surrender, was the most subversive weapon of all. The Pacific Islands became graveyards. Pele'u, Iwo Jima, Saipan, Okinawa, names that would echo through history as monuments to human suffering. The battles fought there were not clean. They were not quick. They were grinding, brutal campaigns where men fought cave to cave, yard by yard, through landscapes that had been turned into something alien and hellish. On Saipan, in the summer of 1944, a Japanese captain named Tokishi Yamada, whose name we know from records kept by a Red Cross worker, found himself leading a shattered unit through the island's interior. The Americans had landed with overwhelming force. Warships pounded the cliffs. Planes dropped incendiary bombs that turned the jungle into sheets of flame. There was no retreat. The Emperor's orders had been explicit: defend the island to the last man. Yamada's unit fought from caves carved into volcanic rock. They endured the concussive roar of naval shells, the hiss of flamethrowers, the relentless advance of marine infantry. Supplies dwindled. Water became scarce. Wounded men lay in the dark, their groans echoing off stone walls. Some begged for grenades to end their suffering. Others simply closed their eyes and waited. When the shrapnel finally found Yamada, it shredded his left leg and embedded itself in his ribcage. He collapsed near the mouth of the cave, his vision swimming, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Around him, the battle raged. But the outcome was no longer in question. The Americans were closing in. His men were dead or dying. And Yamada, for the first time in his life, faced a choice he had been trained never to consider: surrender or die. He chose surrender, not out of cowardice, but because his body made the choice for him. When the Marines found him, barely conscious, they did not shoot. They lifted him onto a stretcher and carried him through the smoke-choked jungle to a field hospital near the beach. He remembered the sound of waves. He remembered the voices speaking in a language he did not understand. And he remembered the terror, cold, suffocating terror, that gripped him as he waited for the Americans to exact their revenge. Scenes like this played out across the Pacific. On Pelew, officers wounded in the brutal fighting for Bloody Nose Ridge were pulled from the rubble by American corpsmen. On Okinawa, where the battle devolved into a nightmarish months-long siege, Japanese soldiers too injured to commit suicide were evacuated to medical tents behind American lines. They arrived expecting execution or torture. What they found instead defied everything they had been conditioned to believe. The machinery of war had chewed them up and spit them out at the feet of the enemy. But the enemy, it turned out, wore a red cross on her sleeve. And she had no interest in vengeance. She was there to heal. The fear was primal. It lived in the pit of the stomach, in the trembling of hands, in the wide, unblinking eyes of men who believed they were about to die. Captain Yamada, now a prisoner, was loaded onto a truck with other wounded Japanese soldiers. The truck rattled over dirt roads scarred by tank treads, past the wreckage of bombed-out bunkers and the charred skeletons of trees. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, suffocating. Each man was alone with his thoughts, replaying the propaganda they had absorbed, imagining the horrors that awaited them. One officer, barely 18 years old, wept quietly. Another, older and more stoic, stared at the back of an American soldier's helmet and wondered if a bullet would come before they reached their destination. The conditioning ran deep. Surrender was not just a tactical failure, it was a spiritual obliteration. They had ceased to exist as honorable men. They were ghosts now, awaiting judgment from demons. The truck stopped outside a sprawling complex of canvas tents. Medical flags snapped in the wind. Generators hummed. Wounded American soldiers on stretchers moved past them, some missing limbs, others bandaged and pale. Yamada's heart pounded. He expected to be separated, interrogated, beaten. Instead, he was lifted from the truck and carried into one of the tents. The interior was a different world. Clean. Organized. Bright with electric lights powered by those droning generators. Rows of cots stretched in neat lines. Nurses moved between them with clipboards and medical bags. The smell of antiseptic was sharp, almost reassuring in its sterility. It was the smell of order imposed on chaos. A nurse approached Yamada. She was young, her hair pinned back beneath a cap, her uniform crisp despite the heat. She glanced at his wounds, made a notation on her clipboard, and then, impossibly, she touched his shoulder. Not roughly. Not with disdain. But with the same steady reassurance a mother might offer a frightened child. Yamada flinched. He did not understand. Around him, other Japanese officers were being tended to with the same brisk efficiency. Bandages were changed. Fours were inserted. Morphine was administered. There were no beatings. No taunts. No mockery. Just the quiet, methodical work of saving lives. The fear did not vanish immediately. It lingered like a phantom, whispering in the back of their minds that this was a trick, a prelude to something darker. But as hours turned into days, and days into weeks, the fear began to crack. And in those cracks, something unexpected took root, the realization that perhaps everything they had been taught was a lie. Her name was Lieutenant Mary Thompson, and she had joined the Army Nurse Corps in 1942 with the kind of quiet determination that does not seek recognition. She had grown up in a small town in Iowa, the daughter of a Methodist minister who taught her that all life was sacred. When her younger brother enlisted and shipped out to the Pacific, she followed, not to the front lines with a rifle, but to the field hospitals where the consequences of war arrived on blooded stretchers. By the time she found herself treating Japanese prisoners on Saipan, Mary had seen enough horror to last several lifetimes. She had held the hands of American boys as they died. She had written letters to mothers she would never meet, explaining that their sons had been brave, that they had not suffered, that they had asked for them at the end. She had scrubbed blood from her fingernails and returned to work the next day because there was no other choice. When Captain Yamada was brought to her section of the hospital, she saw only another patient. Not a monster. Not an abstraction called the enemy. Just a man whose leg was shattered and whose eyes held the kind of fear she recognized from every wounded soldier she had ever treated. She knelt beside his cot and began to work. The shrapnel had torn through muscle and nick bone. The wound was infected. She cleaned it with steady hands, irrigating it with saline, applying sulfur powder to prevent further infection. Yamada watched her in stunned silence. He did not understand the words she murmured, soft reassurances, half to herself, half to him, but he understood the tone. It was the tone of someone who cared. When she finished bandaging the leg, she brought him water. He hesitated, suspecting poison or some elaborate cruelty. Mary waited patiently, the cup extended, until he finally accepted it. The water was cool and clean. He drank slowly, his hands trembling. In the cot beside him, another Japanese officer, a young lieutenant who had lost his right arm in the fighting, was being fed broth by an American nurse from Alabama. The nurse, Sarah Collins, had lost a cousin at Pearl Harbor. She had every reason to hate the men she was now tending. But she had taken an oath, and the oath was stronger than hate. She lifted the spoon to the lieutenant's lips, her movements deliberate and gentle. He ate because he was too weak to refuse, and because starvation is a fear that transcends ideology. When he choked on a mouthful, she patted his back and waited for him to recover before offering more. These scenes repeated themselves across the hospital. A nurse from Massachusetts cleaned the facial wounds of an officer who had called her people demons. A nurse from Texas changed the dressings of a soldier who had fought to the death to avoid this exact fate. They did not do it for gratitude. They did not do it for recognition. They did it because it was their job, and because somewhere beneath the uniform and the propaganda and the machinery of war, they recognized something fundamental: suffering is universal, and compassion is the only rational response. For the Japanese officers, this was incomprehensible. Their entire worldview was collapsing. They had been taught that the Americans were barbaric, that mercy was weakness, that the enemy existed to be destroyed. But the enemy was now tucking blankets around their shoulders. The enemy was administering morphine when the pain became unbearable. The enemy was saving their lives. In his diary, recovered decades later, Yamada wrote, "I do not understand why they help us. We would not have done the same for them. I feel shame." What compelled these women to care for men who had been their mortal enemies just days before? The answers were as varied as the nurses themselves, but certain threads ran through their stories, threads of faith, duty, and a quiet defiance of hatred. For many, like Mary Thompson, it was faith that guided them. Raised in Christian households where the teachings of mercy and forgiveness were not abstract concepts but daily imperatives, they saw their work as an extension of those values. To refuse care to a wounded man because of his nationality was to betray everything they believed about the sanctity of life. One nurse, writing to her family, explained it simply: if Jesus could forgive those who crucified him, who am I to withhold a bandage? For others, it was professional duty. They had taken the Nightingale Pledge, vowing to devote themselves to the welfare of those committed to their care. That pledge made no distinctions based on uniform or flag. A patient was a patient. Suffering was suffering. To treat the enemy was not an act of betrayal, it was the fulfillment of their oath. And then there were those whose motivations were more complex, more human. Sarah Collins, the nurse from Alabama who had lost a cousin at Pearl Harbor, later admitted in an interview that she struggled with resentment. When I first saw them, I wanted to walk away, she said. I wanted someone else to do it. But then I looked at this boy, and he was a boy, maybe 19, and I thought about my cousin, who was also just a boy. And I realized that hating him wouldn't bring my cousin back. It would only make me smaller. Compassion, in this context, became a form of resistance. It was a refusal to let the dehumanizing logic of war dictate their actions. The war had turned men into machines of destruction, but in these field hospitals, the nurses were reclaiming something essential: the recognition that every person, even the enemy, deserved basic human dignity. Some were haunted by the work. They dreamed of the faces of the men they saved and the faces of the American soldiers who had not made it. They carried guilt and grief in equal measure. But they also carried a quiet conviction that what they were doing mattered, that in a world consumed by violence, every act of mercy was a small rebellion against darkness. The Japanese officers, lying in their cots, understood none of this at first. But over time, as they observed the tireless dedication of the nurses, as they felt the gentle hands that changed their bandages and brought them food, something shifted. The armor of propaganda began to crack, and in those cracks, a dangerous thought took root: perhaps the enemy was not so different after all. In the quiet hours of the night, when the generators hummed low and the hospital settled into an uneasy stillness, the Japanese officers lay awake with their thoughts. Sleep came reluctantly, if at all. The pain of their wounds was nothing compared to the ache of cognitive dissonance, the unbearable tension between what they had believed and what they were experiencing. Captain Yamada stared at the canvas ceiling and replayed the moment when Lieutenant Thompson had brought him water. He had expected poison. He had expected mockery. What he received was kindness, and kindness was the cruelest weapon of all because it forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth: he had been lied to. The propaganda had painted the Americans as monsters, but monsters did not clean wounds with gentle hands. Monsters did not sacrifice sleep to monitor the fevers of their enemies. Monsters did not risk their own lives in field hospitals mere miles from the front lines. If the Americans were not monsters, then what did that make him? What did that make the empire he had served? In the years after the war, some of these officers would write about this moment, this quiet, devastating reckoning that took place in the sterile confines of a medical tent. One former captain, in his memoirs, described it as the death of innocence, but not the innocence of youth. The innocence of belief. I had believed I was fighting for honor, for the emperor, for the soul of Japan. But lying there, watching the nurses move between the cots, I realized I had been a pawn in a game I did not understand. Another officer, interviewed in the 1980s, was more blunt: we were ashamed. Not ashamed that we had lost. Ashamed that the enemy treated us better than we treated our own. This was the power of mercy. It did not simply save lives, it shattered illusions. It forced reflection. It exposed the machinery of hatred for what it was: a construct, fragile and hollow, that could not survive contact with genuine compassion. The Pacific War had been defined by brutality, by atrocities on all sides, by a dehumanization so complete that men could kill without remorse. But in these field hospitals, a different kind of war was being waged, a war against the very idea that the enemy was something less than human. And quietly, without fanfare, compassion was winning. The war ended. The guns fell silent. The prisoners were repatriated. And Captain Yamada, like thousands of other former Japanese officers, returned to a homeland that had been reduced to ash and rubble. He walked through the ruins of Tokyo and saw the ghosts of the empire that had sent him to war. The emperor, once divine, had renounced his godhood. The military, once invincible, had been dismantled. Everything he had believed in had collapsed. But Yamada carried something with him that the bombs had not destroyed, a memory. The memory of an American nurse who had saved his life when she had every reason to let him die. And that memory would not let him rest. In the decades that followed, some of these former officers became witnesses. They testified in forums, wrote memoirs, gave interviews. They spoke about the kindness they had received from the women they had been taught to despise. Their stories were not always welcomed. In post-war Japan, where shame and silence often governed discussions of the conflict, admitting that the enemy had shown mercy was to acknowledge a debt that could never be repaid. But they spoke anyway. Because silence, they realized, was a betrayal of the truth. And the truth was this: in the darkest chapter of the 20th century, when the world had been consumed by hatred and violence, ordinary people had chosen compassion. Nurses who had every reason to turn away had instead reached out. And in doing so, they had planted seeds of reconciliation, of understanding, of the possibility that enemies could become something else. Yamada himself became an advocate for peace. He traveled to the United States in the 1970s and met with veterans groups. He spoke at universities. And on one occasion, he was reunited with Lieutenant Mary Thompson, the nurse who had bandaged his leg on Saipan. They stood together in a small auditorium, two elderly people who had once existed on opposite sides of a war, and Yamada bowed deeply and thanked her. Not just for saving his life, but for saving his humanity. The audience wept. Because this was the real victory of the Pacific War, not the battles won or the territories reclaimed, but the moments when people chose mercy over revenge, when they recognized the shared humanity that transcends borders and flags. These stories were buried for decades, overshadowed by the grand narratives of military strategy and political maneuvering. But they endured. And they remind us that the most decisive victories in war are not always won with weapons. Sometimes, they are won with bandages. With gentle hands. With the quiet, subversive power of compassion. And those victories, unlike territory or glory, can never be taken away.